Schoolhouse. I'm Jane Campbell, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Elgin and Area Heritage Society. We're sponsoring this walk, and it's free of charge, but you know, we do have little donation jars over here. So we would be delighted if you feel that you can share something with us. That would be very pleasing. Before we go on the ghost talk, we have the leader, the guide. And I'd like to introduce now Sue Warren.
Everybody. We are going to start on a little walk of Elgin, and rumor has it there's a few ghosts lying around and about. Elgin's an old village, and there's a lot of really neat ghosts. Now, boys and girls, I know we have lots of boys and girls here. I don't want you to be scared. Remember, it's spooky, but it's pretend spooky. I'm just going to say that because we've done a few ghost walks over the years, and sometimes you can get a little scared seeing these ghosts from the past. Story. And this is a story that was in my family. My dad boarded with a chap called Cliff Pennick. Who's heard of Cliff Pennick here? Only a few. Cliff was the barber in Elgin. He also was a very bright guy. He did theater in the village, and actually all through North Leeds and Newborough and Westport. And he was also a famous photographer, and he took a lot of early pictures of the Rideau Canal area, including Shakey's Lock. Dad boarded with Cliff when he was in high school for 4 years, because in those days the high school, oh, boy, you're getting restless. Okay, I'll just finish this little story. The kids had to board with Cliff and his wife, it was Eva, wasn't it? Cliff and Eva. And Eva had a great reputation. She brought in lots of business because she'd go to all the funerals and cry all the time. In any case, during the Second World War, Dad was in London, stationed there with the army, and he went to sleep one night. It was during the Blitz, which was they were bombing, and he woke up about 5 in the morning, and Cliff was standing at the foot of his bed, wearing glasses. And Cliff was like his second father. He lived with him for 4 years, all through high school. So anyway, he sat up in bed, and he kind of shouted, and Cliff disappeared. And so about 2 days later, he got a telegram. In those days, they sent something called telegrams. It was before the internet, from my grandmother in Chapey's. And he had seen Cliff at the exact time that Cliff had died in Elgin. Well, the story doesn't end there. He wrote a letter back home and said, but why is Cliff wearing glasses? He never wore glasses. And it turned out he got glasses the October before. And that's a true story. That's told in my family. And Dad still will tell it if he could remember it. But I hear that the ghosts are rising. So we're going to start on a leisurely stroll of Elgin. And
with a tremendous amount of help from the parishioners, there was over 80 families in the Elgin area alone, and it was a mission of Philipsville. When I came to this area, I came to Toledo.
Now, where's Toledo, Father?
Well, Toledo is in the next township. When I came, it was named Kitten. Then it was after I left Elgin, the name changed to Toledo. Philipsville was a mission of Kitten. Now that's when you quarry the stone, you dig back into the bank, and you quarry the stone. They were worried that the roof of the excavation was going to fall in, so they called me, and they were very concerned. They said, Father, we don't believe we should be working in here. So I went in and I took a look around, looked at the stone and looked at the ceiling, and I said, don't worry, we'll be all right. So anyway, they continued to quarry the stone, and they were done. 2 days spent on the church, but not as much as you would on these days. The rectory in the church cost $9,000. But anyway, the bell was an additional $460. So they started to have different raffles and bake sales and picnics, and they had one picnic. The final picnic was just up past the highway at what they called Keldumpsey Park. There was a piece of land that was owned by the Kelseys and the Dunns, and that's where they had a bit of a park there, and they used to have the church socials there. So they had this fundraiser for the bell. They didn't have enough money, and our neighbor Philip Holliday, who we bought the land from in the beginning, he stepped up and he said, I'll pay for the remaining bill on the bell. And I said to my good neighbor Philip, I said, Philip, what can we do to repay you? He said, when I die, will you ring the bell at my funeral? So anyway, that was done. That was after I had left here, but they said that by the name of Murphy that had quite a few cottage lots for sale. Now I imagine it'd be on Whitefish Lake.
Yeah, actually, one of them was right in the village.
And they sold cottage lots to raise money for the bell. But I imagine a cottage lot that in those times would be quite cheap.
Father, you had a very...
Friends are going to be
Well,
here.
I heard there's some more ghosts, so maybe we better get on and see those ghosts.
I'm sorry, Father, we brought up the rear and we didn't get here in time to hear your name.
Father Michael Spratt. No, but I'll tell you what I did, how I did make money was in the horse business. And I used to have some tremendous deals on horses. And one way that I would make the good deals, I would throw in a bridle. Every horse that I sold with a bridle, just to sweeten up the deal.
But there was one of the early priests was a beekeeper.
I think that Father Dargavel, who followed me, I think he kept bees.
Okay. All right.
I heard a rumor, Philip, that you built this beautiful house
Well,
with the lovely Harriet.
I'd like to take credit, but there was a gentleman from Morton, I believe, who came and built this for us.
Could you tell us a little bit about your house? What year are we talking about here?
1885.
1885.
Yeah.
And obviously, look up at the roof. They even have wrought iron along the balconies.
Slate roof.
Lead roof. Oh, and slate.
Yeah.
And I heard something about that slate had to be shipped.
That's right. They took it up by barge from Kingston, brought it up to Jones Falls, and hauled it all in.
Wow, so by barge, all the way from Jones Falls. Now, could you tell me a little bit about how you were able to afford this house, Philip?
Well,
I hope you weren't mortgaged to the hilt.
I believe, I guess you would say I was a successful businessman.
And what kind of business were you operating?
Well, farming was something I got into, and it was farm machinery.
Oh, farm machinery. You mean reapers and binders and all those kind of fancy...
I have my book here that shows, and yes, the Massey Ferguson.
Oh, Massey Ferguson.
No, I believe it was Massey Harris.
It was Massey Harris. People couldn't pay for their farm equipment. He kind of held onto the liens for Massey Harris. And you'll notice in the land title searches that actually Massey Harris owned a lot of even pieces of land because of the equipment. They'd actually mortgaged the land to get the farm equipment. So I didn't know much about farming, if anything.
No.
And she did learn a lot about dairying because farming was big in this area, but she never would milk a
Never-
cow.
not a cow, no.
Hated milking cows. She was a bit more of a lady. You also, I heard, had another home, another.
That's right, yes, we have a cottage out on Whitefish Lake.
It sounds like you're bragging a little bit, Harriet.
Yeah, we quite like our cottage.
I heard you had the first cottage on
Yes.
Whitefish Lake.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
That's right, on Hog Island. It was going to be developed into a resort, but they decided to keep it for themselves. Well, thank you, Harriet and
Well,
Philip.
thank you.
And the last name again?
Holliday. And Philip was the son. If you look across the street, there's another house. Currently not there, but just where the Gordoniers live. And that was the Ebenezer Holliday farm. So he was the youngest son, and he was the son that stayed in Elgin. There was another son that had a carriage shop up the street going towards the liquor store. But Philip was the one who inherited a lot of the actual farmland and land around this area. And he was the one that kind of looked after the parents in their old age. Their house dates from 1846. And they're actually brick ovens in the basement, bake ovens.
So would that be where the Halliday Cemetery got its name?
Yes. Yes. The Holliday family. It started off as a plot for the Holliday family and then became for the whole community, the Protestant community. Katie, you're up.
Bye, Harriet. Bye, Philip.
There were two other family members that owned it. So, you know, for 120 some years, it really hasn't changed hands that often. We've been here for 18 years. So, yeah.
And are you a Holliday?
No, we're not. No, it went out of the family with us.
Was very interesting.
Oh, yes.
Elected himself.
Well, hello.
Hello, young lady.
Come on over here. Come get a look at the ghosts.
Good evening, everyone.
Well, good evening. And who is this lovely couple?
We are Mr. and Mrs. J.R. Dargavel.
Oh, that sounds very fancy. And
Molly.
what's your name?
Molly.
You're Molly. That's right. Molly Hopkins.
John R.
John R. Now, John
J.R.
R.
You look vaguely familiar, young woman.
Yeah, you've probably seen me squinting around before, sir.
Aha.
Now, I hear this might be your establishment.
Very proud of this establishment. Built it in 93.
93, wow.
That'd be 1893.
That's correct, dear. That's correct.
Yes.
I heard it was the biggest store around in North Leeds. Could you tell us a little bit about what kind of business you were doing?
Well, I had my fingers in a lot of pies.
Oh,
back
you
in
did.
those days.
Bakery then, was it?
You know, I can say this now that I'm dead. I married Molly, but the love of my life was cheese.
I thought it was.
I had 2 cheese factories, one in California, one here in Elgin, and was involved in the Dairy Association.
I
And
heard
so
you
I
were-
had the cellar stuffed full of cheese here.
Oh, okay. So
But-
cheese was
but
what
there
made
was
you.
also the telegraph office.
Okay.
Just about dry goods. I was the clerk of the township for
Well,
55 years.
I heard a story that when Mr. Dargavel was dying, literally on his deathbed in 1930, the township council, so Crosby, sat in a ring around his deathbed while he took the minutes. He was a very dedicated clerk. You also had a little bit of a political role, I hear.
Member of the Ontario legislature. in
Oh, no
fact,
kidding.
yes.
Now, what years do you remember?
Oh, Molly.
Oh,
what year?
that's a trick question.
Yeah, I put that one in.
Our son Sottle helped out quite a bit
He
then at that
certainly
time.
Well, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Sottle took over a lot of the business while you were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to say I was quite happy to move in this building. It was I had gas lighting, I had water pressure, just a lovely, lovely
I heard you
building.
had running water.
We did.
Wow, you must have been about the first people in Elgin besides the Holidays.
It was quite nice to move up from our previous
Now, your
home.
previous store, somebody said it was down the street
That's
here?
correct.
Oh, it was down the street, and it was a rather sad-looking thing compared to this.
Oh, this is just magnificent in comparison.
Now, I hear that you were pretty active in...
Thanks
Yes.
for refreshing my memory.
You're welcome. Well, anything else that we can... I'll just mention that there was a great newspaper article about Mr. Dargavel's funeral, and he had a procession that was way, way out up the Davis Lock Road that followed on foot behind the coffin. It was considered quite... He was quite a bigwig in the Elgin area. And he didn't foreclose on mortgages like some of the other general merchants did.
Not at all, no.
Which made him quite unique, because a lot of them did. Okay, well, thank you, Molly, and thank you, John, R. And we'll let you fade away. And I think we might go and check out the Lashley house across the road.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh.
Who are you?
My name is Henry Lashley, and welcome to what we call Henry and Almeida's mansion.
And when did this lovely mansion go up, Henry?
Well, it's quite a...
Mansion up the street.
Yes.
Is there a little competition going on here, Henry?
Let's just say there is only one building in this town known by Queen Anne's architecture, the style of building of which there are only a handful in all of the county.
Yeah, and all those lovely brackets up there. And
Yes,
now,
fine
could you give
woodwork.
us a little bit of background about where you came from?
Well, I was born in England, but brought to the United States by my parents as a child. After they passed away, I wondered where I would go, and after school ended up in Farmersville. But Farmersville just didn't have enough going on, you see, and well, I was pulled toward Elgin. And
Okay.
not long
Farmersville
after
was
coming here, I had to find a way of making a living, and we opened what we called the $7 store down by Holliday's Corners. Do you know, anyone here know why it was called the $7 store? Because I purchased it for $7.
Now, I hear you didn't just get involved in running the store, you were involved in some other interesting enterprises.
Oh, enterprises. I was involved in the potash industry, you see, for some time, and everyone in the village would bring to us their ashes. We produced tons every year, building up a small fortune.
What did you do with the potash?
Oh, it was used for many things. I'm sure some of your audience know what potash is used for.
So?
Soap. Exactly. Lye soap was just a little too rough. Potash made a finer product. It was used for buildings.
It was used for baking soda.
Realized that the horse did not know where he was. Of course, I didn't pay attention. I was simply the rider. It took me many, many, many years riding these roads, mainly the Chaffee's Locks area. It's a very confusing area. But eventually I find my way back home, and I dabbled in some politics. I was a member of the South Crosby Council and superintendent of education for many, many years. I was a prominent citizen of this town, and I like to think that I contributed more than just producing 7 children, many of whom were successful themselves. One of my sons ran what is today called the Appinicon Lodge. Idlewild, we called it back in the day.
Now, Henry, when did you pass on?
Well, 8 years after building this fine mansion.
So somebody else must have lived here after you left. It's a pretty amazing house.
My wife lived here for 2 years, thinking that perhaps a house to herself would be something she'd enjoy, but she got bored and eventually sold the home to a farmer locally. A farmer of a son who was to become one of the first doctors, if I'm not certain, the first doctor in the village of Elgin?
No. The first doctor was another chap, but Darius was a very
prominent doctor?
Darius Kuhn may have brought many of you into this world, for he was doctor in this village until 1941. After he passed on, the house passed through a few hands, eventually being taken on by the Guthries. And the Guthries took this home and made it into 2 homes for a while because it was so large and I suppose cost so much to heat that an owner of a garage and a pharmacist weren't able to take it all on. But the pharmacist stayed and used the building as his pharmacy for the village until he ended his career. And it was passed on to the community. And community members took the house onto themselves and decided to use it as a place where services could be brought to provide counseling and care for the residents of Elgin and for all of North Leeds.
Well, Henry, we'd like to thank you. We know that you probably want to sort of fade away soon.
Well, I suppose I do need to get back.
Yeah, you're sure it's up or down?
Well, it was a pleasure to find it was up. I did foreclose on a few mortgages that made me wonder when the end came near, but to this day I sit high in the clouds and smile upon you all.
Well, thank you, Henry.
Have a pleasant evening, everyone.
Bye, Henry. Okay. Well, don't get too close. Ghosts disappear if you get too close. Girls, back off. Okay.
The moon was a ghostly galleon on the purple moon. The highwayman went up to the road and up to...
Sir.
My name is Deb Campbell.
Deb Campbell, and you look very distinguished. What would you be in Elgin?
Well, if you look across the road behind you, I started that business back in 1903.
1903?
Some of you people, I'm sure, can't even think of how far that is back. That's 110 years.
110?
Fever. I kept sneezing all the time.
Oh, so you didn't like the hay?
No, I didn't like
and
the
you didn't
hay,
like
and
the
the
cows
hay didn't
much.
like me.
So you came to Elgin.
So I came to Elgin. My brother Ern and I decided that we were going to go in business. So Ern, he went to Portland and he learned how to be a cheesemaker and then went back to Harlem. And I came here and I got a job right behind me here at the grocery store that was there at the time. And I was there for a while, a year and a half, but I wanted to be in business for myself. So finally, I thought, I heard about the funeral business. I had heard about that. You know, people die and what happens, and there was a movement going on up until a few years before. People hadn't been embalmed, you know. They were just put in their caskets and they were buried, and that was it. So I decided that I wanted to be a funeral director. And I went away, all the way to Chicago.
So is that where you had to study embalming?
That's where I studied
in Chicago.
In Chicago. And I came back and I started the business. Now I started, if you turn around and look, that surely wasn't like that. Before I took it over, it was a barn.
It was a barn.
It was a barn, yes. It was a good barn, and it's still standing underneath all that paint and all that building material.
Now, I heard in the early days that the funerals didn't happen at the funeral parlor. Is that true? Did they happen at home?
It happened, yes, it happened at home. That became a furniture store because it was, in those days, it was kind of a combination. You were a funeral director and you were also a furniture, you had a furniture store. And that came from the fact that way back in the 1800s, the people, sometimes they made their own caskets. The fellow who, the family made their own and sold them to people. She was in business for herself. So in 1903, I started in business, and we were married. by the time the war came around, the factories all made war materials. There was lots of work for everybody, but in 1918, everybody here, people who have had the flu, let me see.
Who's had the flu?
Who's had the flu?
Put up your hand if you've had flu.
Oh, a lot of people who
Well,
had the flu, eh?
in the early days before they had antibiotics and some of our modern medical science,
Yeah.
people died from the flu. And the Great Flu of 1918 killed more people than died in the First World War. It came right after the war.
That's right.
And Deb, unfortunately, or fortunately for you, there were a lot of people around Elgin.
There were a lot of people. We had something like 90.
Well, you know, I think that it's time for you to go back to the spirit world, Mr. Campbell, unless you have anything else to tell us.
Well, I could talk to you all night, but I understand I have to go back. But do you know something? Before I go back,
Okay.
when you people go, I'm going to have a cigar.
Well, you have your cigar. And we're going to move on because... Okay.
Who was that there, Robert? What's his name?
House of the Lord. I'm Reverend Reynolds.
Reverend Reynolds. And this is a lovely church here. Now, could you tell us a bit about your church?
This is the second one on this site. The first one was unstable and had to be torn down, and this replaced it in 1894.
Now, why was the first one unstable?
It was built on sand.
Built on sand. That wasn't a very bright thing for them to do, Reverend.
Well, the first builder didn't have the skills of the second one, because this one is standing quite well.
And I heard with the first church there was a story about a balcony cracking
Yes,
at a funeral.
It was a big funeral, and it scared a lot of people when the three-sided balcony started to come down. So they decided they had to tear the church down.
Now, I heard that a lot of people could be fit into this church.
Yes, this church is capable of holding 450 people. It's a wonderful opportunity for the Methodist Church at a time when we no longer have itinerant ministers riding around trying to serve people. But we are now able to have people come here, and it's a glorious time for the Methodist ministry.
Now, apparently, Harriet Holliday's father, Nathan Howard, was a minister here before you.
Yes.
And there was another one called Jared Brown. And Jared was the very first minister here, and he died in his 20s of tuberculosis. And I believe he's buried over there in that cemetery. Could you tell us a bit about your lovely cemetery?
This is not the Elgin This isn't the Methodist cemetery, it's a public
It's a public cemetery, okay.
Most people don't know that. It's on the land of Ebenezer Holliday, who owns much of the land around here, donated the land for the cemetery and this church.
And was it started as I guess a Holliday family cemetery, is that correct? There were Holliday family members and then it just kind of grew?
The minister here when this church was built, and we had a wonderful board of trustees that worked very hard and succeeded in building this church in 1 year.
In 1 year, this whole church.
And through subscriptions that were collected before the building was put up, and at the time of the dedication, the church was fully paid for at the great sum of $9,500.
$9,500. Today that it might buy you a second-hand car. Wow. Where did the stone come from, Reverend?
This is stone from the same quarries that built the canal locks. And these particular stones, many of them came from the first building.
Now, was there a parsonage?
Yes, there were several. There was a wooden one, and then a brick one down the street. The wooden one burnt, and then there was the brick.
And then the brick one. Well, I think that that's a pretty good introduction to your lovely new church. And maybe you could take a little walk in the cemetery now and enjoy yourself.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, Reverend.
Good night, all.
Okay.
Well, we're heading back towards the school. Let's see if there's any more ghosts on.
I was born in 1856 in Ballycanoe, which is just the other side of Charleston Lake. I was the 10th child of 12 to William Beatty and Ellen Armstrong. When I was 6, we moved to Lansdowne, and there I attended public school, or elementary school, and then did my high school in Gananoque. Now, I was awarded, and I'm bragging a little here, I was awarded the first grade A, first class teacher's certificate ever awarded in the county of Leeds. And I worked as principal at the old West Ward School in Gananoque, and then here in Elgin for a while, and then in Farmersville, which you now call Athens. And much as I enjoyed teaching, I thought I could do more, and I needed more challenges. I decided to enter medical school. So in 1880, I entered Queen's in what they called the Royal Physicians and Surgeons College, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, Queen's, Kingston, which was what the Faculty of Medicine was called then. And that was a challenge. It wasn't that I couldn't handle the academic part, but the men did not want women to be there. And I'll give you a little bit of history on that, which has really nothing to do with Elgin, but did have to do with my life. In the 1860s, Emily Stowe wanted to become a doctor, and no medical school in Canada would admit her. So she went to the United States and received her degree, her papers, from New York College of Medicine for Women, and came back to Toronto, but because she was American educated, she had to attend classes in Canada and write, I shouldn't be calling it Canada, in Ontario, and write papers, and no university would let her in at that time. 13 years later, she was finally allowed to write. Now, the second person who led the way was Jenny Kidd. It was Jenny Trout. And encouraged by her husband, she was a married woman, encouraged by her husband to attend medical school, she was able to get in Ontario, but life was made so difficult for them. 2 women in a hall full of men, even led by the lecturers. The men jeered them. There was obscene pictures, so it isn't just me that we do this. Obscene gestures printed on the walls that had to be whitewashed off. So she eventually went to the States too, and received her degree from college in Pennsylvania. So she came back and actually became the first doctor licensed in Canada, Ontario, in 1875. So that was the atmosphere in which I entered Queen's. So Queen's was very supportive. They tried, but the men kept complaining that women didn't belong there and lectures weren't given properly because of the sensitivities of the women and so forth and so on. So in 1883, they expelled the women. That was the end of that. And actually, this was surprising, Queen's did not allow any women into the Faculty of Medicine until 1943. Harvard, though, was 1944. So Queen's was still ahead of the game in a way. So luckily, some supportive people in Kingston founded the Women's College of Medicine, and so I was still able to graduate from there in 1884. I immediately offered my services to the Presbyterian Women's Foreign Missionary Society, and I was sent to Central India. Now, I sailed, and I was on the same steamer as Lord and Lady, not Durham, Lord and Larry, come on, history people. Lord and Larry, he'd just been Governor General.
Not Warren.
No, it starts with D.
Or Dufferin.
Dufferin, thank you. Keep thinking of wheat. Lord and Lady Dufferin. And Lady Dufferin was exceptionally supportive of my work and started a teaching hospital in India and paid for teachers to teach Indian women to look after people. I eventually had to come home in 1892 because of illness and lived in Lansdowne ever since, and died in 1939, I think it was. There is a plaque on my property in Lansdowne, should you ever be down that way. So it was a challenge, and but I was basically a local person and had spent time here in Elgin, all becoming the person that I was. And then the next bit was going to be about the Red Brick School. I'm sure you've said everything about the Red Brick School.
I don't think we've talked much about the Red Brick School tonight, but
Well, if you'd like to hear it, it is a bit. I can. In the 1800s, schools were very poorly designed. They were. They didn't have good light or heat, privies, teaching aids. They were often just big empty boxes. And Reverend Edgerton Ryerson, and I'm sure you've heard of his last name at least, really felt that this was not right. He's been quoted, and I want to just make sure I get this right, that education for everyone was as necessary as light, should be as common as water, and as free as the air. And he was a great supporter for bringing education to everybody, especially out in the rural areas where it was not as formally done. He even wrote a manual describing how schools should be built, the design, the exterior and the interior, and so forth. And this school, although there was a manual came out maybe 10, 15 years later too, that just expanded on his thoughts, is a good example of what the ideas that he held. This school, you will notice the high windows, called the 4/12 panes. This allowed enough light to come into the room. That's why the old schools that you see, and some of us attended, had the big high windows, because it allowed the light to come in. Didn't have the electricity. So this school had the 3 going across Holliday Street and the 1 at the end, and for the big classroom, and then there was a smaller classroom which we presume was used for the senior students. This school was built, I didn't notice that. The school was built on a stone foundation, like backing up a little. The property was bought from Philip Holliday, and Fred Tabor from Morton, who was a brick mason, was hired to build the school and put on a stone foundation. It's sort of a T shape, about 42 feet by 52 feet. And he had excellent ideas of how things should be done, and they followed the plans and ideas that had been suggested by the government. The things that Edgerton Ryerson suggested, such as adequate lighting, which these windows give, and because of the height, the 14-foot ceilings allowed enough ventilation, so the students weren't breathing each other's air. Sometimes when you go into some
public places, you'd think maybe that would have been a good idea had they done that. There had to have usable privies. There had to be teaching aids. And we were very lucky for Elgin that although recommendations could be made from the government in Ontario, they still had to be made to happen on the local front. And the local politicians and the school trustees and the people of Elgin felt that it was important enough for their children to be schooled properly, but even though it was, I think, less than 20 years since the other school had been built, they went forth with the idea of doing this school. And it functioned as a school until 1964. And then in 1987, it was declared a heritage building, and the Elgin and District Historical Society have been renovating it ever since. And there's the classroom that is set up as an 1800s type classroom where primary grades of elementary school kids can come and find out a little bit what it was like to be taught in those days. I'm sure it's not quite as difficult or as bad as maybe it was, because teaching was very difficult then, and or could be. Teachers were paid basically a poverty level salary, and of course there was none of the benefits, and no pensions and no sick leave and any of that sort of thing. And they fetched the wood and brought in the water and tried to have maybe something hot at lunchtime to help with the children have something hot for dinner, in the wintertime especially. They may have tended a garden that was outside, either for themselves or to help feed the kids. And yet they were under the trustees' control, trustees who possibly may not have even been able to read or write, yet they controlled the teacher's livelihood. And heaven help the teacher if they ever did anything wrong, because they were, in many places, they weren't all in bad communities, but many places they were under the scrutiny of all the village people. And of course, if you were female, you could not get married, and you could not misbehave either, or you would certainly be fired. Teachers could whittle their own nibs, pens, suit them to the children. They had to plan, of course, for every level of grade that they had in their school, which could be 8 grades. They had holidays, and there was Saturdays, of course, were off. Sundays were not mentioned, so of course we assumed that was the Sabbath. There was no schooling. They could work 10 hours, but then were expected to go home and either read the Bible or other good books. And certainly in the school, religion was a part of it, although if a parent said no, they didn't want their child to receive any kind of religion, or that particular one, that was okay, that was to be. But I don't think it happened much in the rural schools. Everybody did the Lord's Prayer, everybody had opening exercises and God Save the King. And there was also closing exercises at the end of the day. And discipline was very different from what it is now, and I think it varied greatly from teacher to teacher. But corporal punishment was allowed when necessary, I believe was the term used. One thing I read was if a teacher did all their duties faithfully and without error for 5 years, they would receive, this is 1872, they would receive 25 cents extra a week. I thought that was interesting.
I didn't, your faces. Mark, maybe you can speak, go over a little bit. I said,